Hey guys, so this is just a Nuke primer for anyone who hasn't gotten started in Nuke, and we're going to be going over just the basics of the user interface and how to understand it so that you know where you might be having to look when you start to dive into Nuke. So when you launch Nuke, this is what you're greeted with: the default workspace or layout. The top left here is your canvas, which is where the image will be displayed that you're looking at. The bottom left is the node graph, and this is essentially the layers area of Photoshop, but it's a much more powerful way of doing it. On the right side is our panels, our properties. And so anytime you add a node, like I've added a grade node, it will pop open the properties and we can grade our image in there. On the left we have our tool palette, and this is a list of every single node available to you in Nuke. And some of these, if you're using Nuke and not Nuke X, some of them will be disabled, like I think particles, but you can find the entire list here, and it's really good to go through if you're just exploring the different options that you have for, say, because there's multiple ways of grading things, like with color correct, color transfer, color lookup, a grade node, hue correct. There's so many. So you can look through there. They've also got the shortcuts next to it. Another way of accessing nodes is in the node graph. If you right click, you have basically a replica of this left hand list. However, it's just in text form, which can be easier. For instance, if you're looking for the particles, you want to add particles, then you have the word here, whereas I think it's this one. Yeah, so this is the particles. I don't even recognize these because I don't use them very often. So the last way that you'll add nodes, and this is probably as you get to learn the nodes, you'll use this more and more often, is with your cursor in the node graph area. If you press tab on your keyboard, it will pop open a little hotbox, and this is where you can add, you can type anything you want, grade, scanline render, and it will filter out what is available with those letters. So this is a really great way of adding nodes, and it's the primary way that I would add nodes when I'm working. So one fundamental thing to understand about Nuke is that it cares where your cursor is in terms of applying shortcuts. So for instance, if I press tab while my cursor is in the node graph, it brings up this hotbox. But if I just move my cursor over to this window, and I haven't clicked anything, I haven't clicked anything from going from here to here, and I press tab, it senses where my cursor is, and it's changed the window up here to the 3D view. I press tab again, it goes back to 2D. So I can move between these things and it will react. It's not quite the same on the right. If I have my cursor over here, it just adds the hotbox. However, if you have a box selected, a value, and you press tab, then it will go through the options. Next we have the top of the viewer, which has all our different channels and color space information. You're probably not going to need most of that. I will show you if I add a color bars node. Let's delete everything else and we look at that. This slider here is our exposure, and this one here to the right is the gamma. So these two you'll be using a fair bit if you're trying to just zoom in on a particular area and see a specific detail. And then to reset them, you can click on these red buttons to reset them to their default states. On the right here, these are some really useful buttons to understand. If you hover over them, you'll get a little information bar about what it does. They can be very handy, but if I go through these, you'll probably just forget what they do. But just remember that that's an interesting area to have a look at. Then you have the normal menu across the top, which has a bunch of things we're not going to go into, except that I'm going to show you that you do have other workspaces by default, so you can press Shift F1, F2, F3, etc. to switch between them. So currently this is the Shift F1 workspace, which is the compositing workspace. This is another one. Here's another one. So these can be really handy for certain workflows. I don't use them as much as I should because I use two screens, and I just pop this window out, which you just click and drag, which of course, there we go. So I pop this out to a secondary screen, which for obvious reasons, then I can have this as a full screen. And then I have more room for my node graph where I can drag this up. But I'll leave that there for now. So next we have the timeline area, which is underneath our viewer and attached to it. And this is the frame number that you are currently set to. Now most plates that you get in a production environment will start at 1001 or somewhere around that. And everything is usually set up for you. But at home, if your particular plate that you're bringing in doesn't start at frame 1 or it starts at frame 2000 or something, you can find this quite confusing because it's by default set to 1 to 100. So if you come to your node graph, we can change that by pressing S, which will open up our project settings. You can also go to edit and go to project settings that way. So that's a pretty obvious way of getting to a settings page. And in the frame range, we would then set this to whatever frame range you're expecting. And you can also set, and I strongly recommend this, setting your frame rate to match whatever input you're bringing and your full size format. So if you're working with 4K drone footage or something, change it to the same resolution that your footage is. This will massively help you when you're working, because there's nothing worse than bringing in something that is a totally different format, let's say square 2K, and then actually I'm just going to make that a constant. So if I go square 2K and I merge this over this and merge these two together, see what happens? Like it changed what I'm looking at, and I've got this dotted line out here and whatever the hell's going on. And if I switch these two inputs with Shift X, I use to switch those. If I switch those two inputs, it does something different, because what it's doing is excuse me, it's taking the format from the main pipe. So long story short, if the only thing you remember out of that little segue is set your format size to match whatever footage you're bringing in or whatever final output you want to render, and set your frame range and FPS as well. Other than that, that's the basics of the interface. We're going to do another video where I'm going to show you how to set up the default settings that will help you massively with just day-to-day working, so that you're not too confused and it's a little bit easier to work in.